Genesis chapter 41. Let me start with this. There was a comic strip by Charles Schulz years ago. I don't know if you remember reading Peanuts when they used to have newspapers. Is that still a thing, newspapers? But there was a comic strip. I'm going to have them put on the screen. It says, "Sorry, I missed that easy fly ball, manager," Lucy tells him. "I had it, but suddenly I remembered all the others I've missed." And then the line I went, "The past got in my eyes." Has the past ever gotten your eyes? Have you ever mishandled things? Didn't catch the proverbial fly ball because you didn't think you could because you've always failed in the past? And maybe it's not for you fly balls that you're catching in an outfield, but for you it's a matter of mishandling a lot of proverbial fly balls that haunt you. Something that's even more hurtful and harmful than any baseball game could ever be. And over the years, I've heard many of these stories. Perhaps tonight it's the way your family treated you in the past that gets in your eyes often. Maybe even when it makes it difficult for you to respond rightly to your present family. Maybe you've grown up and you have a family of your own, and you find yourself having the tendencies of being kind of like the things you never said you'd wanted to repeat from your family when you grow up. Maybe it's the way your dad related to you as you grew up in his home and how badly he influenced you, and you say, "I'm not going to be that kind of father to my children," but then you find yourself doing the same things. Could it be that your history of sinful choices have made it easy to believe, like people told you growing up, that you are a failure and you'll always be a failure? And that's what it's like. That's what you'll be like. Coaches, parents, teachers, you'd say maybe they're all right. Maybe they were right, that I'm never going to amount to anything and I'm never going to accomplish anything good. I've heard stories like that, and people have those types of things and far worse in their past. And you could go to abuse of all different kinds, verbally, violently, sexually, all kinds of things. And people have a hard time getting past their past. And their past gets in their eyes. And this is one event or numerous events or maybe ongoing events that they could never get past. It seems to cloud everything. They see everything through this lens. And if you're not careful, that can happen to even God's people. Joseph had to learn how to handle his past. There were ample opportunities. If you read his story, chapters 37 through 50, he had to get his eyes off the past. And he had to get his eyes on God. And even though it is absolutely true that his brothers treated him horrifically, and at that point he could have said, the dreams that God gave me, they're nothing but nightmares. He could have let his past get in his eyes, and beyond that, in his heart and in his mind. And maybe you're here tonight, and it's probably true that for some at least, that you really, no one else knows how much you're haunted by these issues and these things in your past. So let me ask you, is that how you see your suffering? Do you see your suffering as fruitless, empty, banal, not worth anything? Do you see what God is allowing to happen in your life tonight, financially, physically, relationally? Do you see it as a dream that has turned into a nightmare? Or do you see, as I prayed, pain has a purpose? That it's not lost on God, the things that you're going through. Joseph had to get a handle on his history so that he could fulfill his present and his future part in God's story. You must handle your past so it does not determine your present or your future. Let me say it again. If you don't understand about how to handle your past, it will determine your present and your future. So you might say, "Pastor Walker, what does it mean? And what does it look like to handle my past in a biblical way?" Well, let's look at Joseph's life tonight. And I think we can get, and I'm going to call them 4 valuable history lessons on how to handle your history. So let me give you 4 valuable history lessons. And again, chapter 41, we'll get there in just a minute. Number 1, and by the way, a lot of the material I got tonight is from a guy's book is God Will Tell You Who You Are by Klein Snodgrass. And it is a great book. It's either number 1 or number 2 book on identity and your story and how to live your life, including your past, I've ever read. So it is well worth it. I can give you more information if you need it. But a lot of the things I'm saying tonight comes from what I learned from that book. History lesson number 1. You must learn to connect your history to God's history. I don't know about you, but I love history. I know it's kind of nerdy perhaps, but I do love it. And I love ancestral things. My dad did a whole thing in our family. He said that we had American Indian in our family, and he said all these things, and we didn't have any of those things. And so I'm mostly Scottish by far, and a few other things in that area, a little bit of Irish and whatever else, but that's about it for me. But we're all born into histories, and if we went through, right, tonight you could tell me your family history, your country history, and you could have your cultural history, your ethnicity history, your faith, religious history. And we are born into these things. In fact, I've had someone tell me one time, you know, you're only a Christian because you were born in America into a Christian home. You don't really know what you believe. You just took what you got, and that's what you have. And so there's a lot of people who believe, but let me tell you this. We have a narrative identity. In other words, our identity is wrapped up in our story, which has all kinds of parts to it. I think if you're here next Wednesday night for Thanksgiving Eve service, we've asked 2 people to give their testimony, and I'm not going to say any more about it because I'm thinking it's going to be really excellent. But they're going to tell you how amazing things God did in their story and how he changed their life through it. And maybe you could say the same thing tonight. But know this, all of your experiences and choices contribute to your history, not to mention all the things that other people have done in your life, for good or bad. And how you handle your history, and this is not an overstatement, will either enable or enable you to live out God's story in your life. Joseph had to learn to connect his history to God's history, or maybe you could say connect his story to God's story. And he demonstrated it by making his suffering and slavery a God issue. So let me show you what I mean. In the chapters that he has been written about him, especially chapters 40 through 50, he uses God's name more than any other person in the book of Genesis. In fact, in chapters 40 through 50, he mainly uses Elohim, just the generic word for God. He uses it 26 times. And Joseph, meaning, is the person who uses the vast majority of them. And when we get to our chapter 41, verse 50, it reads, "Before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, a priest, bore them to him. Joseph called the name of his firstborn Manasseh. Manasseh's name means God has made me forget." But look what he says in verse 51. "He has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house." Consider this. Joseph was thrown into his history, meaning he was born in a certain family with a certain dynamic, and he has lots of brothers. Different people had mothers in that group, and it's a mixed up, chaotic, and most of the time messed up life that he entered. He was thrown into that history. He was thrown into things that he had very little, if any, control over at all. He was sold as a slave to Egypt. His brothers got rid of him and faked his death. And then he was become a slave in Potiphar's house. He was put into jail for crimes he didn't commit. And he wasted away for years and forgotten. By the time he got out of the pit, from the time he was put in the pit to the time he was in the palace, was 13 years. He was 17 when it started and 30 when he got out of it. So this was no small thing. And when you hear him say, God made me forget all my hardships. Can you imagine all of them? After he left and was thrown in the pit, he never saw his mom alive ever again. And he didn't think he would see his father. It's one of the first things he asks when he reveals himself to his brothers. All the hardships of being thrown in a pit, sold as slave, and be forgotten. 13 years. That is a lot of hardships. And the Bible says, all of my hardships and all my father's house. But you know what's cool about him? He did not take the hand-me-down hate because his brothers hated him. And he could have been easily on his own. He could have taken that and said, I'll take that. I'm going to use that hate. I'm going to get back at them. He never did any of those things. Not at all. Which makes me want to say that you cannot change your history, and hear me, you cannot ignore your history. Both of those are very dangerous. He couldn't change anything in his history that he was thrown into that others had done to him. And that is probably the biggest part that people struggle with in their past. What do you do? Not just my own sinful choices, but what do I do to people, adults, others in my life who did all these things, said all these things about me, made me feel this way? What do I do with those? Let me tell you this, you can't change it and you shouldn't ignore it. He didn't write a lot of his own history, but hear me, he was able to respond and interpret all of his history. See, can I tell you that's what you need to connect your story with God's story. And when you do, you'll find out that all suffering, hear me, all suffering, no matter who, no matter what form, no matter how long, God has a purpose in it. It's never accidental. It's never meaningless. Never. And when you connect your story to God's story, then God's going to build. He's not going to change your history, but he's going to help you see it through a completely different lens. And so what does he say in our text? He named his son Manasseh, listen, for he said, God has made me forget. And if you'll find out, see when he says Ephraim in the next one, verse 52, God has made me fruitful. Now watch, when you connect your story to God's, here's the perspective you get. You say, I'm not ignoring the reality of what happened to me because there were bad things, negative things. He says, it was in the land of my affliction, verse 52. He said it was characterized by hardship, and no one's not sympathetic. There's no one here that isn't unsympathetic to people who've gone through all kinds of horrible things in their past. But here's what happens. When you get your story connected to God, you see the whole picture. Most of the people I talk who struggle, they have this narrow lens, and all they see is the past and what happened to them. But they don't see the big, but Joseph says, oh, you know what? It was hardship, but he also made me fruitful. Fruitful in the land of my affliction. So here's what can happen for the Christian who has their story tagged up with God's. You know what it is? See, it can be a really bad situation, but it can be really good for me at the same time. God can bring and work out a lot of good things in my life. For God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. See, his geography change did not change his theology. Just because he was taken away from home, never got to go back there except after when his dad died. Because the geography changed and all the people he around changed, but his theology didn't change, because what he does is he constantly at every possible turn puts God into the equation. Joseph didn't let his past get in his eyes so that he couldn't see all the things that God was doing, and not just the bad things, but the good things. So number one, here's what we have to do. We have to learn to connect our story to God's story. That's the number one history lesson that we really, really need to learn. Number two, you must learn to own your own history without letting it own you. Joseph's history was not changed but God did transform it. If you think that you cannot go in reverse, to spend all your time on the past, it'll not change. But you can reinterpret it. You can restructure it. You can repurpose it. And that's what God does. And he transforms it. Have you ever read 2 Corinthians chapter 1? It says, well, you can give comfort to people in their suffering. And where does it come from? Out of the comfort that God's given you. So you know what your suffering does in 2 Corinthians? God lets you suffer sometimes because it makes you usable to be able to help someone else who's suffering in the same thing. And I can't tell you how many people have lost a loved one, and I've been able to go to someone in church and say, hey, they went through the same thing. Can you sit down with them and tell them how you got through it? So God has, listen, God says, I can transform it. Trauma, here's what he says. Trauma shapes us, but God shapes us more. Joseph handled his past in a biblical way, and it determined his future. And in our text, remember Genesis 41? He gives us the names. There's naming going on. So he gives us the name of his son, Manasseh, and Ephraim, and he tells them what their names are and how significant it was. And every time he saw his sons as they grew up, it reminds him, oh yeah, when I see you, I'm reminded, this is what God did for me. Look what God took me from and took me to. And he always was a visual reminder of how God is sovereign in all of his past. But that's not the only name change in the text. Earlier in the text, it says that the king of Egypt, Pharaoh, he changed Joseph's name. And Joseph's name in Egyptian was Zaphath-Paneah. And it means God who speaks and who lives. Now that's Egyptian and referring to an Egyptian deity. But can I tell you this? Joseph takes the name and reinterprets it toward his own God. That his God spoke and his God lives. And he took the Egyptian name and reinterpreted it. And it was this: God speaks and God is there. God lives. See what he's doing there? Can you see what he's doing? His Egyptian name was not his identity. His Egyptian staying there in his position in the Egyptian government was not his identity. It was not even being an Israelite. That wasn't his identity. His identity was who he was in God. So he was in Egypt. He was not in Israel, but those are not the things that defined him. He was in God. That's what Joseph was. And Joseph's primary I could say identity was not his name or his ethnicity or his country, as I said, any of those things, but who he was in God. Let me show you a little bit more. Hold your finger and turn back to chapter 50, the last few verses, which are most famous out of his life, I think. In chapter 50, in verses 19 and 20, in fact, verse 18, we'll start there. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, this is after his dad died, and they thought, oh yeah, after all these years, he's going to finally take his revenge. By the way, it'd been 17 years, and they're still worried about it. Joseph wept before them, and his brothers came. Behold, we are your servants. But Joseph said to them, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? 2 times in Genesis, Jacob said it once when Rachel said, I have to have a child. You better get me have a child. And he says, am I in the place of God? See what he says? See, he had connected his story to God's story. And now he says, here's what I got to do. I've got to have this history lesson as part of my life. And that is, I have to learn that my history doesn't own me. God owns me. God is sovereign. God is completely control of every part of my life. And so he says in the text, as for you, verse 20, you meant evil against me. He doesn't deny his past. He doesn't try to downplay his past. He's actually talking to his brothers who did all these things to him. And all the years have passed. He hasn't forgotten it. You know the old thing, forgive and forget? There is no forgetting. But there is forgive and forgo. In other words, all these years later, it's not haunting him anymore. He's got past it, way past it. He doesn't even live any. He's so far past it that he says, I'm going to do things. I'm going to forgive you. I'm going to love you. I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to provide for you, not just you, but your children. And he gave him the best of everything he possibly had. Now, hold on. Let me just repeat this. Remember this. I want to tell you a little bit more about what they did to him. And then if you don't see that as wonderful as it really is. Genesis 42:21, his brother says, we saw the distress of his soul when he was in the pit. They saw, listen, when he begged us. He was distressed, he was distraught, he was begging them, he was crying. And it says, and we did not listen. Psalm 105, Joseph, who was sold for a servant, his feet were hurt with fetters, he was laid in iron until the time of the word of God came. So you know what they did? They watched their brother. They took him, they put him in chains and shackles on his legs. He was crying, he was begging for them to take him back the whole time. So you, listen, when he says this, you meant it for evil. I'm imagining he's having flashbacks in his mind. I remember all these years later, I remember how awful it was. But he says, in spite of all that, he goes, here's what I do. I forgive you. I love you. You didn't take care of your brother, but I'm going to take care of your family. Do you see what he's doing? He says, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. Good and evil. It's what starts Genesis in the garden numerous times, good and evil, and it's how Genesis ends, good and evil, because it's still around in our world. And Joseph doesn't just say this, and listen, this is the problem. Most people who have a problem with their past, all they focus on this, you meant it for evil, but the other phrase is left out of their vocabulary. It's left out of their thinking, out of the paradigm, how they respond. It's not there. All they can say, you were evil, as if that's all there is. And Joseph said, when you have God and you've connected your life to his story and you're not owned by your past, you will understand that evil is subjugated to good every single time. And by the way, it's the same verb. You meant it in Hebrew, meant they purposed it. And it says, and God meant it. Do you see how they are parallel and next to each other? Which means this, people can do awful things to you, but none of them are out of God's control. God's meant is always over man's. They can purpose things, but God's purposes are the greater meta-narrative umbrella that covers all of them. There is no purpose. All you have to do is look at Jesus, who was by the purpose and foreknowledge of God in Acts. He was crucified. They all got together and purposed to crucify Jesus, but God's umbrella was over all of it, and he had purpose in Jesus' pain, and it was our salvation. History lesson number 3. You must learn not to use your history as an excuse for failure or disobedience. Joseph could have said when Potiphar's wife tempted him, he could have said, I'm 17, I'm here by myself, everybody's abandoned me, my brothers sold me, no one cares about me, and obviously perhaps God doesn't either, so I might as well have some joy in my life. But he didn't. Joseph and his brothers, he could have said, they've forsaken me, they hate me, why don't I just do whatever I want? But he never made excuses. He never used his past as a reason to do sinful things in his present. Is that you? I've had a lot of people tell me this, Pastor Walker, if you know what my marriage was like, you would say, I deserve to look at that stuff on the internet. I deserve it. Their attitudes, their emotions. You'd be angry too if you had to go through what I've gone through. Yeah, I may do this and I may do that, but that's nothing compared to what I could do. I've heard all of those arguments before. You know what? I don't have any joy in my life. If I can tell you, I struggle just to make it. So yeah, do I eat too much? Do I buy things at the mall? Do I do that? Yeah, they say, but it's okay because I deserve it. Excuses after excuses that we use. I lose my temper because my dad did all the time. In fact, my dad lost his temper and he hit me when I was growing up. At least I am not violent. My wife left me, and I deserve more than that. And so at times it's possible. Daniel, his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I'm exiled in Babylon. No one knows I'm here. I'm young. Listen, God wouldn't think hardly anything bad of it if I bowed down. Under a lot of pressure. Can you know what I'm going through? Do you know what I've been through? So we tell ourselves. So we practice situational ethics and whatever is good at the time based on our feelings and how we deserve to be treated. We blame shifted onto our circumstances and our situations, and we end up never getting past our past. And we wonder why we keep defeated by the same things over and over again in our lives. Because here's the reason why. Because we've never learned that our past is not the reason why we do what we do. Oh, it's influential, but it's never determinative. And we do not act out, and we do not lash out, and we do not sin and do some things that we do, and we don't just spend money on things to make. We don't do all those things for no reason. We do them because we're trying to find something to fill the void and the emptiness, and it's not God. It's not God. Last one, number 4, history lesson number 4. You must learn not to give defining force to your own history, but the history that you are in most of all, and that's Jesus. Chapter 45, would you turn there and we'll close? Chapter 45, verse 4. So Joseph said to his brothers, "Come near to me, please." And they came near, and he said, "I'm your brother Joseph." And what's the first thing he says when he reveals himself to them? "Whom you sold into Egypt." Ready? "And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because," watch, remember this? Remember chapter 50? "You meant it for evil," parallel. God meant it for good. Listen to how he talks. Same thing. He says, "Because you sold me here, for God sent me." Parallel again. You sold me. God sent me. Do you see how he looks at his life? It's radically God-centered suffering. He says, yeah, here's the reality of what happened on a human level. You sold me here. We could say this, you were evil. But here's what he says, but God sent me. See, this thing that happened to me, this suffering, was not primarily about misery. It was about mission. And he had to come to the realization, listen to this, that what happened to me wasn't mainly about me. And in chapter 50, he says, hey, and here too, God sent me here on a mission so that I could keep all of you alive. That the seed of the woman, the big context of Genesis, the seed of the woman that's carried in Judah, it won't die because I got Judah enough food to live on during the famine. He had to come to the realization that all the pain is not so narrowly minded as if God only has you in mind. What if he has all kinds of other people, all kinds of other situations in mind? God sent me. God made me. Look at verses 7, 8, and 9. And God sent me before you. He has to say it over and over again. To preserve you for a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me, but God. Verse 9. Thus says your son, God has made me. God brought me here. God helped me go through all this. And God has put me in the pit. And God has put me in the prison. And God has put me in the palace. Every single thing in his life, everything was a God issue. We derive our identity from either God's story or someone else's, our own. God says, well, here's what he wants us to do. He wants us to transfer power from our story to God's. In fact, if you look at it this way, salvation is a complete revision and restructuring of your identity. Paul would say it this way, you know what your true identity is, your most primary important one? It's not your background, your ethnic background. It's not your political persuasion. It's not the job or social status that you have. Here's what he says. You are died with Christ. You are buried with Christ. You are raised with Christ. You are seated with Christ. That's who you are. Our histories are not to be given ultimate power. God's history and God's story should have ultimate power. And let me tell you this, how important that is, because if God's story is not your narrative, the main thing that you see everything in life from, then something else is, and there's a word for it in Scripture, idolatry. We are the people who let God tell us who we are. Our bosses don't, our parents don't, our friends don't, our enemies surely don't. God does. He said, and I'll quote Klein Snodgrass one last time, Christ is not an add-on, hear me, not an add-on to our existing identity. He's not an add-on like you would look for an option on a new car when you buy it. Rather, he takes over our identity so that everything else in your life becomes an accessory to him. That's the difference. He says Christians have adopted an identity that is not our own, and we've made it our own. Our true history is the history of Christ. His story is our defining story. Our personal history is influential, but not determinative. And I want to close with his last phrase because it's a warning. The self is never without a center. It's always engaged in the production of its own center. A wrongly centered self needs to be centered by the nails of the cross. That's what he's talking about. Tonight, someone, something is in the center of yourself. Someone is telling you who you are and what your identity is. Someone is telling you that this is the story and the narrative that you should live in. And someone tonight is telling you this is how you look at your past. This is how you interpret the events. This is how you see them. And it can either be through your eyes or someone else's eyes or God's eyes. And the question is, what will you give defining force to? Who will tell you that this is the story that you and your children will live in? Because for Joseph, it changed everything. God used Joseph in a wonderful way, but because he had a handle on his history, he made a big difference. What about your history? Let's pray. Father, I don't know here tonight people who are perhaps struggling with their past. And that could come in all shapes and sizes, all kinds of different forms and expressions and manifestations. But Father, I pray today that we would see our past for what it truly is, the reality of it, the pain of it, the hurt of it. But we wouldn't let it own us, but we would own it in such a way that you could use our past to transform our present and our future. As long as we're looking back, we have nothing to look forward to. God, change that tonight, because that could be radical transformation in the lives of parents and their children. Maybe adult parents and their moms and dads. Perhaps it could make the difference between a husband and a wife, or two friends who no longer have a relationship. Father, you know all the needs of every heart and mind and individual here tonight. I pray that you will help us to learn the history lessons that Joseph's life provides us, and that we would handle our history differently because we've heard this story and been in your word tonight. And we'll thank you for these blessings for Christ's sake. Amen.